This episode is brought to you by Wear Buff, your go-to for Buffalo-inspired apparel. Get your hands on stylish t-shirts, hoodies, and more at wearbuff.com. That's wearbuff.com. And make sure you use the promo code TWB at checkout for 10% off your first order. Stay Buffalo proud with Wear Buff. We are continuing our positional review series with the linebackers and the safeties this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome into another episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast, a show on the Buffalo FamBase podcast network. My name is Justin, and I will be your host today. And before we get started, this show is brought to you by Wear Buff. Partnered up with Wear Buff. You can get links to all their clothing, merchandise, all that right on our website, wanderingbuff.com. Some pretty sweet stuff out there. So just make sure you check that out. I'm going to be talking about it for a while. There's some awesome designs. There's new designs rolling out every month or so. So just make sure you're checking out Wear Buff. Today, we're going to continue our positional review series, and we're getting pretty close to the end here. Today, I want to talk about the linebackers and the safeties, and just kind of, it's hard for me because there's like a lot of change here, but there's also some that's not changing. It just looks a little different because of injuries we dealt with last year. So I mean, in general, kind of hard to just straight up review these position groups as a whole, because we're missing key players for most of the season. Micah Hyde missed most of the year. Matt Milano missed most of the year. Linebacker core was ravaged with injuries. We're playing different styles. We're playing defense different stylistically because of injuries. We basically had Poyer playing most of the season as, a long and late linebacker. So I think there's a lot to like here. There's some room for concern, and then there's just some question marks going into the season that we got to see how it plays out. So your linebackers for 2023, Matt Milano, Terrel Bernard, Terrell Dodson, Dorian Williams, Bale Inspector, Tyler Medikevich, and hey, we even got AJ Klein. So as I mentioned, this was just a position group that was absolutely decimated by injuries. I mean, we're talking playoff games where we're calling AJ Klein off the streets, jumping off a family vacation to come play a playoff game. I think going into this offseason, Bean didn't want that to happen again. Kind of been loading up on linebackers, and honestly, I think it's an interesting mix that we have going into 2024 with Milano, Bernard, Dorian Williams, Bale Inspector, adding Edifwan Ulofoshio in the draft, adding Nicholas Moreau in free agency, Deion Jones, and then out of UB, Joe Andreessen. And I think you kind of have the loss of a long-term staple special teams player in Medikevich. And I think that one's interesting because for me, this has kind of been the off season of, we also see when we get to the safeties here, Saron Neal departing, and these were guys that were, pretty well played special teams players that have been around for a while. So part of my discussion with, what am I excited for, concerns, whatever, does include special teams for these areas. Just because those players were not just like, core special teams players, but like they've existed only to play special teams. If they get on the field for snaps, it usually wasn't going great. And I've been like, I've both praised Brandon Beane for emphasizing special teams, but also like had criticism for it of, how many guys are you going to pay multiple millions of dollars to only be on special teams? But also like special teams is the third phase of the game. It does matter. You see games turn on their heads real quick with some poor special teams play. So I think it's going to be interesting to see kind of how those roles are replaced with some younger talent. And ultimately, this is what we're looking at is more towards how I would love to see the team built of like, yeah, these guys are new core special teamers. They're young players that were in the draft that have special teams ability, and hopefully they develop into something, on the offensive or defensive side of the ball, and not just, a full roster spot taken up for a guy that is only playing, 10 snaps a game, something like that. I like looking at the fact that hopefully with this, new depth that we brought in, we can put AJ Klein behind us. He's had some great moments as a Bills player. He's been consistently professional and good in the community. All those things that you love to see from a player. I think last year was going back into the well one too many times for me. And I honestly, in the situation the Bills were in, like back against the wall, you got a guy that, has been around the team, knows the playbook, can kind of slot in. But AJ Klein's always had his limitations, and that's fine. I'm excited to, hopefully be fully turning the chapter on some different depth pieces there. There are a couple of players that I'm pretty excited about for being depth. I'll say first and foremost, because I don't want to, just glance over them because they're such good players. But with Milano and Bernard, for my money, that's, one of the top linebacker duos in the league. And so we only see them together for, a few weeks of the season before Milano goes down for the year. And even at that, like, Bernard was looking really good. But this was also, his first live game action. There was tons of questions about the middle linebacker position coming in. And Bernard, Matt Milano has earned all of my love, all of my respect. I've come to expect great things from him. Bernard quickly took up that mantle after Milano's injury because the season that he had with the situations around him of, he doesn't have his running mate in Milano all season. He's got Dodson next to him. He's got Poyer on, passing downs. He's calling the defense. I don't know how many of you out there, but I had very little faith in him going into the season. So for me right now, Bernard, like, the sky's the limit and could be, one of the top 2-3 middle linebackers in the league. So I'm super excited for him, super excited to see him and Milano play together. Hopefully we can get a full healthy season, and that absolutely changes the dynamics of this defense. But a couple of players that I'm also excited for are Dorian Williams and Balin Spector for this season. And I'll start with Spector. He's dealt with a lot of injuries thus far in his career. But what I think is interesting about him is through the start of his career, like when injuries would pop up, he's kind of been the first guy in off the bench. And that's like after drafting Dorian Williams. It's been like Balin Spector coming in first, and we've seen him in some action and, some plus and minus. But he's typically been the first one off the bench. Dorian Williams is kind of setting up in that Terrel Bernard, but with less expectations for me right now. And very similar, third round picks when we didn't really think we needed a third round linebacker and, didn't really see the field much last year. When we did see Dorian Williams, he made some plays, but he looked like he was, to me, taking a second to react and not just playing loose. And then when he was reacting, playing a little fast, overshooting things, getting sucked in the wrong direction for that half tick that, kind of leaves somebody open. But all of the, talent and athleticism there to be able to make an impact. So going into, his next season, I feel pretty good about him, having to come in if there's any sort of injuries again with Milano and Bernard as your top two there. You just hope that no injuries happen. You get to rock with those two awesome players the whole season. But between Spector and Dorian Williams, I'm excited for them as depth pieces to kind of take that next step. Then we have Edefon Ulofoshio. We'll see what happens there. A later round draft pick. And for me, this is probably going to be something that's, a couple of year development. But as it stands with the players in front of him right now, again, if you have a healthy Matt Milano and Terrel Bernard, you're making your impact on special teams anyways. So a player that I'm excited to see what happens there. And then just kind of rounding out the depth, I think Joe Andreessen out of UB, I think that's a fun story. Guy that played right around the corner at UB. And we've seen a couple players like this. Cam Lewis is kind of the biggest example of somebody that came from UB and hung around the practice squad for a while. And, after a few years was able to kind of get into the mix. And you'll see when we move into the safety room here, Cam Lewis just got an extension and might have a chance at, actually starting. So I think he's intriguing for, kind of that long play. And then between Nicholas Moreau and Deion Jones, I don't know how many of these guys are going to make the roster. Between the two of them, I feel like you've kind of reestablished the floor of like the Terrell Dotson level backup of, you can get adequate play out of these guys. I think that the season that Dotson had last year, I think speaks volumes to like the coaching and the scheme, because he was kind of just a long-term special teamer on this team. And when he had to come into the game, I know a ton of us didn't have very much faith in him. And he had overall a pretty great season last year. So when you take some of these guys that I put out there as just kind of like reestablishing the floor, I think you can get very adequate play out of either of those guys in a pinch, and kind of bringing up them last on purpose here of if we have, those starters, we have some backups that I'm excited about. Hopefully, if we get in a shitty situation again where our depth is, last year was crazy. We got healthy right before the playoffs, and then we're playing our fourth and fifth cornerbacks starting and our fourth and fifth linebackers. Just the defense got decimated. But if you have to go down that list of players, a little bit more youth here, on younger players that have been developing. So, they've been in the system a couple of years under their belt. Hopefully those are your primary backups now. And then when you have to get into the depleted depth, you're not calling AJ Klein. You have, these guys that are actually like active in the league and around the team, yada yada. So going into 2024, I feel good about this group right now. I do think that we're going to see this be like a position that gets tinkered with throughout the offseason, kind of on the tail end of the depth chart there. The Bills like using linebackers and special teams, and we've kind of bolstered up the numbers right now, but are those going to be the guys that make the team? Because as it stands right now, we have 8 linebackers on the depth chart, and they typically keep 6. So we'll see where that goes if the 6 are already there, or if we kind of see a little bit of tinkering on who's going to round out the group. But I feel pretty good about that group for this season. I feel good about that group going forward into next season. At safety, obviously some real big changes here. Going into last year, Jordan Poyer, Micah Hyde, Damar Hamlin, Taylor Rapp, Cam Lewis, and Saran Neal. Obviously, Poyer and Hyde, 2 huge Buffalo staples. They're, real instrumental in turning this organization around. They've been great leaders. They've been great players. Just kind of embodied everything that's been Buffalo for the last 5 years. So a couple of real hard guys to replace. For as great as they've been, players had to play through a lot of injuries. We've seen Hyde dealing with some pretty serious stuff and, missed a ton of games over the last 2 seasons. And this one still stings. It still sucks to see them go. But I think with the mindset of getting younger and cheaper, we've kept this core together to make that playoff push, that Super Bowl run, and just haven't gotten over the hump. And every year they're getting a little bit older, just a tick slower, all those things that add up after a while. And do I think that they could have, kept those 2 together maybe if Hyde feels like playing and made one more run of it? Yeah, maybe, sure. I think it was getting to be time, and it being kind of seemed pretty set on resetting some salaries, resetting, the roster a little bit this season. So it is what it is. This is the hard part of sports, right? And then rounding out the depth there, Damar Hamlin, which was an interesting case last year, obviously, coming back from pretty gruesome, injury on the field there in Cincinnati. Spent a lot of last season inactive. So what to look forward to, I'm not quite sure. Taylor Rapp was somebody that I was really excited that we brought in last year. He was on my radar for a Poyer replacement when we weren't sure if Poyer was coming back. And found him to be a bit disappointing last year. I know he's talked about having, some personal stuff going on, and last year was kind of just a weird year. I do think it's interesting that this is a guy the Bills went out and got last year, and while I can say that he wasn't exactly what I was hoping for last year, I do think that it says something that the organization was around him for all of last season, and, they had the choice if they wanted to, pivot and go in a different direction or stick with this guy. And they decided, hey, last year probably didn't go exactly as we planned. We still like what you are. We're going to bring you back. Now slotted into most likely be a starting safety. So hopefully, everything kind of comes together there. One of my bigger concerns with Rapp is kind of his play style in general. Plays with a bit of reckless abandon and just kind of throwing himself all over the field. We've seen some friendly fire. Just dial that back a little bit, young man. And we'll see what happens this year. And then Cam Lewis, I kind of briefly talked about being brought back, and like I said, he's kind of done the long path to, being consistently on the active roster, gets himself a contract extension now, and he's also in the mix to be starting here. So great story there. And we'll see how that plays out with some of the new additions to the room. And then finally, Sirron Neal, I already kind of mentioned with him, just a special teams ace, and that'll be something to be mindful of as we see how that position gets replaced for special teams. But as far as, his role is kind of like a dime cornerback, rotation safety, and I kind of lump him in a few different places. When I see him come on the field defensively, it doesn't get me excited. So for the purposes of the defensive side of the ball, I think that was a good spot to move on. As far as special teams goes, we'll have to see how that gets replaced. So going into 2024, obviously a very different group here. Taylor Rapp, we have the draft pick of Cole Bishop, Mike Edwards, D. Delaney, Damar Hamlin, Kendall Williamson, and Cam Lewis. And I think for what you're losing in Poyer and Hyde, they've done a really good and interesting job of kind of replacing those roles. And you have a combination of guys that have been in the building that you're kind of promoting, bringing back in Cam Lewis and Taylor Rapp. You have an infusion of youth with a second-round pick in Cole Bishop, who I'm super excited for. Anybody out there that follows Bruce Nolan or listen to the Bruce exclusive, this is a player that he was super high on, and if you listen to Bruce, if you follow Bruce, secondary is his thing. He loves cornerbacks and safeties. And I'd seen him talking about how fun of a player this is, how excited he is for Cole Bishop, and that gives me just a little extra uptick of excitement there. Mike Edwards, brought over from the Chiefs. This is like your veteran addition to the room. That Super Bowl pedigree, little bit of leadership in that group, and could be a week one starter. We'll see what happens. But I think with the mix of kind of promoting some of your own guys, bringing in some youth, and then bringing in this, I don't want to call him like a safety net veteran because he also has limited starting experience. But just somebody who has some years in the league, some success in the league, brought in to compete. Cam Lewis already kind of talked about, excited for him to get the opportunity. I think this is one of those players that is I'm never planning on him being like a superstar game changer. But to just kind of keep that floor of what this group can be, if the basement of what our safety play looks like is Cam Lewis, I think that's a world that we can live in. And then you kind of hope that between Rapp, Bishop, Edwards, Delaney, to an extent, you hope that those are the guys that kind of take the top off of where that floor is. So Cam Lewis in the mix as a depth option, possibly getting some starts. We've seen him play a good amount of football this year, and I know Cam Lewis is always hard for me because he has some of those just gut-wrenching, plays against him that those ones always stand out more. It's similar to, James Cook's drops last year. Like, okay, he didn't have the most ridiculous amount of drops, but every drop that he had was about to go for a touchdown. Kind of similar with Cam Lewis here for me. And, the Minnesota game where he's matched up against Justin Jefferson and, gets mossed is one that always stands out. And it's easy to play that one in hindsight and, he should have made the play, whatever, blah, blah, blah. He is in that moment going against the best receiver in the league. So with the benefit of hindsight, it's a little bit easier to give some grace there. But in the moment, I was quite upset with him. So a pretty exciting group there with a lot of changes. The wild card for me here is Damar Hamlin. I thought before, his injury in Cincinnati, I thought he was developing pretty nicely as a safety, and kind of similar commentary on him as I have on Rep right now of like the making full speed mistakes and, like relying too much on the athleticism and that getting him in trouble sometimes. And then I don't really know what to make of last year. Like, if he's back from his injury, then he's back. But for me, he was spending so much of the time inactive last year that it's really hard to measure him. And I don't want to make light of anything that happened to him. Obviously, a very scary, horrific incident. And the fact that he was even able to slap on pads and walk back on the field the next year is more than I can ever say for myself. So, ton of respect there. All that being said, before I get a little controversial here, it's pretty simple for me in either he's good and he can play, or if he's not, then I don't want to see the roster spot taken up for him to be inactive every week. And I know can sound callous on my end, but the way I look at it is the Buffalo Bills were put in a very difficult situation in that spot, and I think they fully did right by Damar Hamlin. They fully guaranteed his contract. They let the timelines be on him. They gave him the opportunity to come back. To me, they did right by him, and they gave him the opportunity to play again. They didn't hit his pocket because of a crazy injury, anything like that, where the team wasn't required to do so. They could have been like, oh, that was terrible. We're just going to cut you. We don't have to guarantee this money, and we're not going to touch that in the future. For me, this is kind of the pivotal year of, is he fully back? Is he feeling good? Is he now, taking that next step again? And if he's not able to do that, I think just the way they filled out this room, he's got an uphill battle to make this roster and make an impact. And this is one of the things where football, with everything else that's involved with it, it is a business, and they have to make business decisions. So if it's kind of like a decision between do we let D. Delaney, Mike Edwards, somebody like that, like, are we getting rid of one of those guys to keep a spot for Hamlin, for him to be inactive? It's a really hard situation for me, and I'm glad that I don't have to be the one having those conversations. I will wrap this up saying that when we originally drafted Damar Hamlin, I was very excited about the pick. And I still have a pretty high level of excitement for Damar Hamlin if all of that is in the rear view. And for me, this is kind of the year where that matters of, can we get you on the field playing? If somebody goes down, can we count on you to be the next guy up? And if we can't answer those questions with a pretty confident yes, then I think it's just, unfortunately, time to look a different direction. Kind of wrap that up on a low note, but hey, there's the linebackers and the safeties going into next year, reviewing last year. Drop a comment. Let me know what you think about either of these groups. If there's any free agents floating around that you'd like to see added to the mix, anything like that. I do always ask that you like, share, subscribe, tell somebody about the show if you're enjoying it. We got some vacations coming up between myself and Jake here. We're going to try to play with the recording schedule and the, editing schedule to make sure we're not missing any weeks. The day of the week might get a little bit screwy, so make sure you're subscribed so you're not missing anything. Like I said at the top of the show, check out wanderingbuff.com, check out WearBuff, get yourself some sweet gear ahead of the 2024 season. And I thank you again for joining me, and as always, go Bills!